Welcome to Now We're Getting Somewhere. I'm Katie, and I'm a certified life coach, but I've also been a management consultant at McKinsey and a product manager at a tech startup. In other words, I know what it feels like to have a life that looks pretty good on paper, but doesn't feel as good as I want it to. I help my professional clients develop lives that are more meaningful, happy, and also more successful. And I want to share the same practical insights with you. Let's go. Hey everyone, this week I wanted to talk to you about recovering from burnout. I shared some thoughts about recovering from burnout about a year and a half ago on my newsletter, and a lot of people told me then how much it resonated with them. And in the 18 months or so since, I've been thinking even more about burnout. Partially that's because so many of my clients come to me tired and burnt out to some degree, so I have a lot of in the trenches experience with helping them recover. But also, I've been thinking about burnout a lot because, unfortunately for me, some life circumstances have resulted in me confronting my own burnout over the past 18 months. So these original ideas that I developed about a year and a half ago have gotten a lot more refined, and I've had a number of new ideas to share as well in the meantime. It turns out I have so much to say about this. I have spent over 7 hours just preparing this podcast topic, then I'm actually going to divide this podcast in two. I will share two concepts on this episode, including one which is really big and has a bunch of component parts and examples from both me and my clients. And then I'm going to share 5 more concepts in the next podcast. So 7 concepts total. But before we get to my ideas and hopefully insights for you, I did want to share a bit more about why I've been thinking so much about burnout recently. I mentioned it in some of my earlier podcasts, but I have twin boys. They're about 2.5 at this point. I'm recording this just before Thanksgiving in 2022. And over Memorial Day of 2021, when they were 11 months old, one of my sons started having seizures. So that kicked off an emergency room visit, a hospital stay. There were lots and lots of tests and procedures. Sometimes they had to put him under a general anesthesia to do those tests or procedures, which is not a parent's favorite thing. And sometimes he had to be hooked up to electrodes on his brain for 24 hours. We did that a couple of times. So in the process, we also tried a bunch of different medications, some of which had some pretty serious side effects on him. And then there was a period late last summer, so August of 2021, when he was seizure-free. And we figured they might stay gone and he might be okay. And I kind of took my first big breath in a while, and I wrote my first essay about recovering from burnout in my newsletter. And then the seizures came back. Unfortunately, they were worse than they had been before. He was having them more often, and his particular kind of seizures, the doctors had some fairly serious concerns about what would happen to his brain in the long term if he kept having them. So we really just needed them to go away, to say it mildly. And without going into the next few months after that, I'll say that after some more drugs at a higher dose this time and tests, the seizures did go away, thank goodness. And they have stayed away since. So, whew. But simultaneously, just as we were treating the return of the seizures last fall, we were really coming to see more clearly the extent of his developmental delays. We did a number of assessments, and his current diagnosis is that he has global development delays, which really just means that he has significant, or some of his therapists would call it severe, developmental delays in a bunch of different areas, in particular his cognitive development and his communication. At this point, just to give one example of how that manifests, we're not really sure if he'll ever talk, for example. And that's not just me as a parent being anxious about whether he'll talk. That's what his neurologist says. He may eventually talk, but he also may not. And even beyond his verbal communication, his nonverbal communication is just also very, very limited. So logistically, last fall kicked off what has been over a year of trying to get him as much support as I could. Speech therapy and occupational therapy and physical therapy and this thing called infant stimulation. And he goes to a special developmental preschool in our area, and all the paperwork and coordination and appeals to the state to pay for more than they initially wanted to pay for and everything that goes along with that. It's funny, the seizures sound more urgent, and they were, but I've actually found the journey of trying to get him support for his developmental delays to be even more draining and hard. Like, it's just a much more complex situation. there was this very precise treatment for his seizures. We went to the doctor, they gave us medication, we tried it. If it didn't work, we tried a different one. With his development, it just all feels really complex and nuanced. And to be totally frank, it has felt like a lot more on me to kind of navigate that system. And even that last sentence, where I talk about it has felt like a lot more on me. By the time I reach the end of this topic, especially part 2 of this podcast, you'll see why I can't kind of say that sentence without stopping and examining my own thinking, but we'll get there when I get there. So that's a big part of why I have felt pretty exhausted and at times very burnt out over the past 18 months. At times, that burnout has been from the logistical load of just trying to get him ramped up for services, navigating that whole system, finding him new specialists, or sitting in on his therapy sessions, or filling out forms or whatever. And at other times, frankly, it's just been the emotional toll of all of that. Because if I'm being honest, this has brought up a lot of grief and a lot of fear for me. And I am sure that a more emotionally or spiritually advanced person would be completely unattached and really not have a preference to what happens in terms of their child's development. I mean, they would care, but they wouldn't, be like, oh, I really want my child to be able to talk. And to be clear, I will say the maybe obvious, but still true things, which is, I absolutely love my son now, and I will love him no matter what. I do think he can have a wonderful life no matter how his life ends up looking. And also it's still early, so his life could look like a lot of different things. So I want to say all those things because all those things are true. And also, to be authentic, I have spent a lot of this year worried for a lot of different reasons. Partially because in this year, from about 1.5 to 2.5, when development is typically very fast, kids learn a lot during this time. He has developed, he can do some new things, but it has just been so slow. And for a kid who's severely delayed already, and then to just have very slow development, it's been really hard for me. To be frank, I have trouble talking about what's going on for him in a group of people without breaking into tears. So I'm just trying to share that has been a real part of my journey this past 1.5 years. And to be clear, with respect to my personal situation and my son's, I don't share any of this for pity. I can actually think of a number of people who I know personally who have had or are having a far tougher time right now than me. And I will also say that I've really hesitated to share about this, even on this podcast. I do share a fair amount about me in my newsletter and now in my podcast, but I share about me personally. And sharing about my son, I worried that I was going to violate his privacy. I discussed it a lot with my husband before sharing. My husband was always really supportive of me talking more about this because we both know how helpful it can be, to hear the personal side of someone else's story. And if you're struggling with something that is burning you out, I want you to know that you're not alone. And the last thing I will say, just as a kind of a high level point, is that obviously over the course of this podcast, I'm going to talk about my personal version of this story, not my son's, because my story is the only one I can tell. I can't totally know how he feels about all of this. And frankly, he's a pretty happy kid. He's a pretty happy toddler. He seems mostly fine, which is, just as a side note, an important thing to note, right? But bottom line, I wanted to share this kind of personal side of my things to say that when I am talking about burnout, I have been there. And before we begin with my ideas about burnout and how to recover, I just wanted to share one more note here about the condition of being burnt out and about finding a definition for that. I'm sure there's some medical or scientific definition of burnout, likely many in the world. But to me, burnout is just this feeling of I am completely empty. I am tired and I am exhausted and I have nothing left. I think most of us have been there at some point, and most of us intuitively know what that feels like. My belief is that burnout can vary. We can be slightly singed, to use the burnout metaphor, or we can be totally burnt to a black charcoal crisp. And I'm just not too precious about my definitions for this one. If you feel that you're burnt out to any degree, I agree with you. And if you feel that you're burnt out to any degree, this episode and my next one are for you. So, without any further ado, here are the first 2 of 7 insights about burnout. The first one is, you do not get to decide what burns you out. You do not get to decide what burns you out. And I will give a personal example here. One thing that always exhausts me, always is specialist appointments or tests for my son. And perhaps unsurprisingly, we've seen a lot of specialists. We've seen 2 different neurologists, eye doctors, 2 different audiologists, a developmental pediatrician, and more. And many of those we've seen several times. So yes, sometimes it makes total sense that I am tired after those appointments. Like sometimes he needs a 24-hour video EEG. That's the thing where he's hooked up to electrodes on his head and monitored over video for 24 hours as well. And me or my husband is at the hospital with him for 24 hours. And he's hooked up to a long cord the whole time. And we have to make sure he doesn't get tangled, and we have to amuse him. And it's just a lot. But sometimes the appointment itself is only an hour. And yes, we have to drive to the hospital and wait, but the whole round trip is maybe 3 hours. But invariably, after even one of even those specialist appointments, I am exhausted. I'm cooked for the day. And honestly, I am tired for most of the rest of the week. And if I'm being honest, there are frequently times where my brain feels very annoyed at the level of exhaustion I feel after these appointments. In my darker moments, I feel weak and ashamed that I get tired after just a measly doctor's appointment. Like, shouldn't I be able to handle it? Especially given that we have been to so many. Why aren't I used to them by now? And yes, of course, I could give you all the good reasons why I get so exhausted. It's not just the time. It's that every specialist appointment brings up all of my fears about his future. And my brain ends up thinking it should do a million things for him or beating myself up for what I'm not doing for him. It's just like this layer of exhaustion and stress lands upon me. But also, I just really don't want to get so tired after those appointments. If I could decide whether to get burnt out after those appointments, I would choose not to get burnt out. I mean, who wants to be cooked for the day and pretty tired for most of the next week? So here's the thing. Yes, there are things you can do to more effectively recover from burnout. I'm going to talk about a bunch of them, but also the first step is just accepting your direct experience of burnout. If you're tired, you're tired. Do not argue with it. Do not act like it's not there. You do not do yourself any favors there. From my perspective, burnout is kind of like a gushing wound. Ignoring it only makes it worse. The best thing you can do is to accept what is happening. Then you can move on to actually treating the gushing wound versus going about your day, pretending like it's not there, and then getting blood on absolutely everything. Which leads me to my next point. The second insight I want to share with you about burnout, which is about levels of burnout recovery. In observing myself recover from burnout, I started to notice that there were 3 levels to my recovery process. Once I turned it into kind of a model for myself, I noticed that I was able to recover faster because I knew what to do at each level and the common pitfalls, and I could kind of track my progress through them. Honestly, in my brain, it started to feel a little bit like a video game with 3 levels, which was kind of nice when you're burnt out, because burnout or exhaustion can feel kind of endless and overwhelming. But 3 levels, a video game, I could do that. I noticed that this model of 3 levels often applied to my clients as well, and it was often really useful for them when I shared it with them. So now I wanted to share more about all of those levels with you. And of course, as is truly everything I share, if it doesn't apply to you, let it flow right by. Everything else I have to share in the next podcast will still be relevant. But levels, 3 levels. The first level, level 1, is when I am the most tired and burnt out. In level 1, not only am I uninterested in my big picture goals, in things like growing my business or reaching more people, but also even what I consider to be my self-care basics often feel too hard or completely unappealing. For example, I would consider my self-care basics to be things like daily journaling or lying on the floor for 10 minutes a day or stretching for 10 minutes a day. These are things that in general make me feel good and I actually really like doing. But in level 1, even those things can feel hard and completely unappealing. And often I won't do some or all of them in a day. I think this is really important to say because if you follow my work in any capacity, you will often hear about how I've been journaling nearly daily for 10 years or how I like to lie on the floor almost every day and take a walk almost every day. And all those things are true. I do those things most days. Though, as a side note for the record, even when I'm feeling well, I don't do all of them every day because I'm not perfect. every day would be perfect. Just most days. But also, if I'm in level 1, I often let some or all of them go. So level 1 for me is characterized by this feeling of, I am so tired, and I'm struggling to continue with life. Big picture goals and self-care practices feel really hard and really unappealing in level 1. And the other thing that is characteristic of level 1 for me is that I notice a strong desire to indulge in more of my indulgences, which for me are indulgent foods like sugary or floury or fried foods and screen time. Those are separate things. Indulgent foods and then screen time, in case that one wasn't clear. Level 1 is maybe obviously not where you want to be for most of your life. You feel tired and agitated and uninterested in all of the wonderful projects or activities or hobbies that you might typically love. So the goal, obviously, is to get you out of level 1 as quickly as possible. And after a lot of self-observation and trial and error and watching my clients as they recover from burnout of all types, I have come to believe something very strongly. The fastest path out of level 1 is to lean into it as profoundly as possible. I'm going to say it again. The fastest path out of level 1 is to lean into it as profoundly as possible. Leaning into level 1 starts with naming to yourself that you are in level 1 and not trying to act like you're somewhere else. And then you need to do 2 things. Number 1, you have to drop anything that's not absolutely, positively necessary. So I will say that for some people, this part, dropping everything that's not absolutely, positively necessary, is the toughest part of level 1 because you have to slow down. You have to accept that humans are fundamentally stoppable and that life is forcing you to stop. You have to accept that anything except what is absolutely positively necessary will not get done. And let's be real, some people consider way too many things to be absolutely positively necessary. They consider things to be absolutely positively necessary that are not absolutely positively necessary. And then because they're doing too much, they're trapped in level 1, often for a quite long period of time. And I will say, as a side note, this is a place where a one-on-one coach can be very helpful because a coach can help you identify what actually might be dropped and help your brain become okay with actually dropping that thing. Because let's be clear, it's not enough to just identify it. You have to have new thoughts about that activity. You have to believe that it's totally fine, even for the best, for you to drop it. In fact, you have to start believing that the fastest path towards where you want to go is in dropping these things. So to give you one concrete example, I had a client who had some very challenging health and personal issues in her immediate and extended family. And she was a caregiver and a key support person to a bunch of people in her life. She also had a job which she was really good at, and her employer loved her because this client, and I actually work with many people like this client was pretty much good at everything she did. And as a side note, while this might sound like a dream scenario, being good at everything you do, people who are good at everything they do actually have a unique set of problems that tend to arise because everything in life has a good side and a bad side, and being good at pretty much everything is good in some ways, but it's actually bad in others. But anyway, back to this client. She was really burnt out and likely had been for a long time before I met her. But this caregiving and support side to her life was really important to her. It was a non-negotiable, which I respect, and I did not push her on. But this client also wanted to make a shift in her career, try something a bit different. But she was never quite getting around to it, to actually figuring out what she would do instead and taking steps in that direction. Here's the thing. You are not going to do your best, most insightful career envisioning when you're in level 1. When you're super burnt out, you just do not have the energy to do that kind of self-reflection. So I knew that in order to actually do that kind of self-reflection, in order to have the creativity and the insight to figure out what she actually wanted to do next, she had to recover at least partially from burnout first. And she was not going to be able to stop all of this caregiving and support. That was a total non-negotiable for her. So slowly we started to explore what she could move around. One possibility offered to her was that she could take some time off of working so she could get the energy and time back, she could rest, and then she could explore her next career path. And at first, that idea, taking a bit of time to rest and not work, it also felt completely off the table for her. She had a bunch of thoughts like, I can't throw away a job that I'm really good at. I can't give up an opportunity to make money. She also had the thought, people will judge me. And I want to be really clear here because she did have people in her life, people who were close to her that disapproved of her quitting her work. It wasn't an empty fear that her wacky brain made up. People did have thoughts and questions about it. That's the thing about this. These fears are often based in something real. And this is, again, where a coach can be helpful because I didn't shove her or yell at her and tell her that she was wrong. But I also didn't just blindly agree with the thoughts that her brain was thinking. When she had the thought, I can't lose the chance to make all that money, I pointed out to her that she might make more money in the long term if she gave herself a chance to rest and figure out what she actually wanted to do next. When she had the thought, my family is going to suddenly need my income and I won't have a job, I pointed out to her that she, in particular, is amazing at everything. And if her family was ever in a dire financial situation, which it wasn't at the time, she could absolutely find another job. We had a lot of conversations from many different angles. And it's very subtle work dismantling existing thoughts and coming to believe something new. Even with a coach, it can take quite a bit of time to really pull apart the knot of existing thoughts and kind of knit a new blanket of beliefs, to give a metaphor here. But I will say, as subtle and time-consuming as it can be with a coach, it is so much easier and faster than doing it on your own. Because eventually, she came to believe the thought, I need to have energy in order to come up with the best ideas for my professional future. And also, and I love this one, she came to believe the thought, the fastest way to my next job opportunity is to actually take some time off now. And for any of you who are sitting out there who are like, oh my gosh, I can't hire Katie. She's going to make me quit my job. Okay, slow your roll. I would actually say that I have far, far more of my clients who stay at their jobs. And these are clients who often come to me thinking they need to quit. I have more clients who end up staying at their jobs than clients who end up quitting. But the coaching is always customized to the client and always in their best interest. I just don't want you to think I'm going to be like, life coach says quit to whatever you say. Okay. And I'll also say what I always say about these examples, which is when it's not you, when we're talking about it in retrospect, these thought errors, like the ones that my client was having, feel so easy and obvious. Like, well, of course you should take time off. But when it is you, your thoughts feel completely factual and entrenched. They feel like a law of the universe. Just like I might say it's 78 degrees today, my other thought about what I need to do for work is also factually true. It feels like not thinking those thoughts would make you a wacko person. It took an enormous amount of courage and insight on her part, but she did take a break from her job. And I watched her have that extra time, and I heard her tell me how helpful it was to her healing from burnout. I noticed a huge shift in her capacity to think about other issues that she really wanted to think about. So this is a great example, I think, of a person who took an additional step to really allow herself to fully rest, to fully inhabit level 1. So that's the first requirement for getting out of level 1. You have to have a willingness to drop anything that's not absolutely necessary. And you have to have a real rigor to your exploration of what's really truly necessary. That's the first thing. The second thing is that you have to really let yourself live level 1. I'll say that again. You have to really let yourself live level 1. One of the core pieces of level 1, as I mentioned, for me, is that I have a strong desire for my kind of typical indulgences, which for me are indulgent food and screens. And for a long time, I felt a really strong ambivalence about this desire. I would think to myself, I'm a life coach, damn it. I shouldn't indulge in sweets and screens so much. I should just lie on the floor and feel my feelings fully. But I have found over time that if the goal is to get out of level 1 as quickly as possible, then the best thing to do is just to lean into those desires. So yes, in level 1, I do let myself indulge a bit more in screens and sugar, or just indulgent food more generally. And to be clear, I'm not like binging on sweets. I'm not eating a whole cake for a 10 a.m. snack, but I will have a bit more of those things than I typically would. And here's why. I have found over time that I can delay levels, but I cannot avoid them. So if I get all up in my head about how I shouldn't indulge in screens or whatever, and I try to push myself to do all these self-care practices that in my core, I just don't actually want to do, and I try to force myself to not spend a few hours vegging online, which I really, really do want to do, I can manage it for a while. I can force myself to follow that path, but eventually my level oneness is just still there. It's still waiting for me. I've pushed it off a few days. Maybe I pushed it off for a week, but I'm going to eventually have to go through level 1 anyway. And I found that it's actually way more annoying to have it later because it feels like I've moved on, but then I haven't, and then I'm back in level 1, and then I'm tired. It's just like I'm still going to have to do all the level 1 activities anyway, so it's much cleaner and faster to just be where I am. So I will let myself have more chocolate or pastries or peanut butter cups, and I will let myself lose an afternoon or a multitude of afternoons, if necessary, in SNL videos or tango dancing videos on YouTube. And I don't fight it because fighting it would take energy that I don't have. So some of you may be listening to all this about level 1 and thinking, but I've been in level 1 for 2 years, for a decade. I'm on Instagram all the time. I'm eating peanut butter cups all the time. Why am I not feeling better? And I would say that one of 3 things is probably going on if that's your situation. The first one is that it does take time. And if the longer you've been a burnout, the longer it can take to recover. So please do have some patience. And I'm going to talk more about that in my next episode. The second thing I would say, to echo what I have already said about level 1, is that you may not be going deep enough into level 1. And I will say more about this in the part 2 of this episode too. But sometimes with my client, you need to take even bigger steps in order to actually clear enough space to rest. I see this a lot in my coaching practice. It's very common. But the other equally frequently occurring situation, honestly, maybe even more frequently occurring situation, when someone tells me this, I've been stuck in level 1 for 3 years, is you might be stuck in level 1 because it's actually time for you to go to level 2, but you haven't done it yet. So with that said, let's talk about level 2. For me, level 2 is still a level when I am not at my full capacity. I still need to be gentle with myself. I'm still not super interested in my big picture goals, like improving my French or growing my business. But the key to level 2 is that in this level, I do need and want to do my self-care basics. For me personally, there's always a subtle moment when I can just tell this cookie, these SNL YouTube videos, it's not serving me anymore. I can tell because instead of feeling better, which I had been for most of the time when I'd been indulging in that brownie or that random vlogger's day in the life, I start feeling either neutral or subtly worse. And I will say that for me, it's not necessarily like I just naturally start doing the self-care basics again. I mean, sometimes I do. Sometimes I'm just craving my journaling, so I'll do it. But sometimes I will start doing some of them again. Like maybe, as I said, I'll start craving my journaling again. But I'm still on screens more than I know really serves me. And I can just feel myself being dragged down by that excess internet browsing or maybe, excess cookies or whatever. And then there's even a third situation where sometimes I'm not doing any of those helpful self-care practices naturally. I haven't yet started them, but I can just feel that I'm starting to feel icky from the indulgent things. And I know it's time to make the shift. So for me, there's often a moment when I notice that I've stopped feeling better from the more indulgent activities and have started feeling worse. And I really have to say to myself, okay, Katie, we're in level 2 now. Let's make sure that you get your core practices done today. And I will literally say to myself, okay, Katie, let's make a list and you can cross everything off as you do it. Let's get the journaling in. Let's go lie on the floor. I know that you're resisting, but you're going to feel so much better when you actually do them. And I do them and I do feel better. And the key thing about level 2 is that what's required of you is still a gentleness and still a setting of realistic expectations and priorities. And as a side note, some people really, really struggle with realistic expectations and priorities. But Within that, it also requires the subtle and gentle discipline to do the basic things that are really, really good for you. And another thing that is worth saying, and this is really just me geeking out on my own model, is that of course there's variation even within the levels. So like an early level 2, maybe I just focus on the most basic self-care things. Maybe it's just 1 or 2 things to really get me started. And maybe I'm still doing a bit more of the indulgent things that I will eventually do. So it's, I'm coming out of level 1. And the flip side of that would be a really late level 2, where I feel great and I'm really moving through life at a brisk clip and I'm doing all my practices and I'm not doing a ton of indulgent stuff that doesn't super serve me. I've cut out quite a bit of it. Though, to be clear, I will always watch SNL YouTube videos or whatever. It's just a lot less time overall. And some of my personal practices are about when I choose to indulge in all of that, etc. And I will also say that one of the keys to level 2 is figuring out what energy investments give you the best return. I'll say a bit more about that. To use the energy debt metaphor from episode 1 of the podcast, I would say that in level 1, you just have very little energy to invest. So your returns on investment are also small. Like, it doesn't take very much energy investment to watch videos of young Mormon family vloggers in Hawaii, which is a strange rabbit hole of content that I have fallen down recently. Like these young Mormon families who are 25 and they have 2 kids and they're blonde and they live in Hawaii and they just seem very happy. But anyway, it doesn't take much energy to invest in watching those. But also, frankly, I can spend a lot of time doing that and it doesn't actually give me that much back. And in level 1, that's fine. You just need to rest and let the tank refill. Unfortunately, if you just rest and wait and make sure that you don't keep burning yourself out, it will refill enough to get you to level 2. So that's the good news. But the bad news is that the kinds of investments you're making in level 1, they just aren't the kinds of investments you want to make in the long term. Like the return that spending 4 hours online gives me in terms of the energy it gives me back, it's just not that great. And it's really important to say, realizing this insight took me years. Like I spent years thinking that vegging online or on a screen was how I recovered best. And look, it's fine. That stuff is certainly fun. I'm not knocking it or saying you shouldn't do it. I'm just sharing from extremely careful empirical observation of myself that the ROI I can get from those same 4 hours, if instead of being online, I read a novel and then journal and then take a walk and then stretch and maybe then read a New Yorker, because heck, 4 hours is a lot of time. That will be out of this world compared to the return I would get if I spent those 4 hours online. So this is all to say, once you do have some energy, and you'll be able to feel it when you do, you need to make investments with that energy in a way that will give you a better return, because you can make really amazing energy investments in level 2, investments that yield an enormous return on investment. You put some energy in, you get a lot back. And one of the tricky things about level 2 for me, and I think for many people, is that it can also take some trial and error to figure out what will truly give you the most bang for your buck in level 2. So for example, for me, I think I spent a lot of my mid and late 20s struggling to get past level 1. I really was very, very rarely in level 3, which we'll talk about more in a sec, in my 20s. And a big part of it in retrospect, I think, was that I really didn't understand what a bad ROE. Can I make my own concept and acronym? Return on energy. I didn't understand what a bad ROE, my technology usage, was. Once I kind of stumbled upon making some small gradual changes to how I relate to technology, I was astonished how much my energy improved. So for me, a key part of level 2 is making sure that I'm really careful about how I relate to screens. And to be clear, I'm not saying that you need to make any changes to your screen usage. I don't know what you need to do. Everyone's different. That's the difference, and a really important difference between energy and money. If I put $1 into Google stock and you put $1 into Google stock, it would yield the same outcome. But if I spend an hour journaling and you spend an hour journaling, it might yield different results in terms of return on energy. So that's why I say you have to be profoundly intentional about how you invest your energy. Your investment strategy needs to be very customized. But to pull back the camera a bit to talk about these two levels at a higher, more conceptual level, I think that level 1, level 2 show this really interesting push-pull of just being a human. That there's a time to let everything go, and on the flip side, there's a time to pick it all back up again. We need to be able to do both things. We need to be able to let it all go in level 1, and we need to be able to pick it all up again in level 2. And we need the wisdom and we need the discernment to know when to do each. It's also worth naming, I think for most of us, one of these two things, either letting it all go or picking it all up again, comes more easily than the other. It's maybe easier for us to let everything go, or it's easier for us to pick it all up again. It can be interesting to ask yourself, which one comes more easily for me? Which one feels really hard? But to summarize, that is level 2. Yes to basic self-care, no to having an interest in kind of big picture goals. So let's now talk about level 3. Level 3 is the fun part. Level 3 is when you actually have energy, you feel good, and you get to decide what you want to work on with that energy. You can take up hobbies, you can follow through on big projects at work. What a joy! And truly, it is a joy. But since I'm here to kind of walk you through the levels of this video game of recovering from burnout, I also want to point out the top mistake that people make in level 3. And it's this. The tricky thing about level 3 is that if you're not careful, you can still use up way too much energy and find yourself back in level 1. I've done that. I've gotten so excited about my business and personal development and hobbies, and suddenly I'm exhausted again. It is very, very annoying. So the way to avoid this actually is to remember two things. 1, your supply of energy is still not infinite, even in level 1. I know that's an obvious thing to say, but all of us need that reminder, I think, even me. And the second thing you should remember is being advanced is being really good at the basics. Being advanced is being really good at the basics. Because here's the thing. The other thing that can drain you when you're in level 3 is not doing those basic things that you did in level 2 that make you feel good, that recharge you, that give you that really amazing return on energy investment. You know, even advanced musicians still do the scales at the beginning of every warm-up. Soloists in the New York City Ballet still do the same bar exercises as absolute beginners. They're just incredibly consistent with those beginner basics. And of course, then they layer the advanced things on top. So part of that is figuring out what are, to you, your basics, and not letting the excitement about doing those big picture, ambitious things distract you from that. So I'll give a personal example here. I have made one of my basics to be reading for an hour a day. Partially, I just really enjoy reading, and let's be clear, sure, I do read The New Yorker, and I do read books on self-development, and sometimes I even am very impressive, and I read books on the history of the US, but mostly, I read romance novels. So to me, reading for an hour a day is a very consistent way, a very easy way, a way that I enjoy to fill my tank. But sometimes when I get excited about other projects, I might start skipping my reading. And it might feel okay for a day or two. I don't really notice anything, but I will always eventually, within a couple of days, start to really feel it. And by I start to really feel it, I mean that I start to feel tired. My tank starts to empty faster than it fills. And that's just not a great thing for me. A way better way to approach it is when I am disciplined. And I don't say disciplined in the drill sergeant way. There is a gentleness to my discipline, a softness to that. But I am disciplined about maintaining the level 2 basics, the things that just really, really juice me up and fill up my tank. And yes, if we're being very tactical here, that means that there are less hours to focus on level 3 projects. But also, it means that I can stay in level 3 for so much longer. Then I don't have to deal with the annoyance or frustration of realizing that I am back at level 2 or even level 1. It's way better to stay consistently at level 3 from my perspective than overdo it and have to climb back up again. Okay, so that's my whole spiel on levels. To summarize, in level 1, you're just totally exhausted. You are not interested in big picture goals, and you're also not really interested in basic self-care. And the secret to level 1 is just to drop everything that can be dropped, to let yourself feel that way and to indulge within reason. I'm not recommending that you go buy 24 donuts and eat them in one sitting, but you let yourself have a little bit more of those things if you need to. You're really just resting and you're waiting for level 2. Level 2 is when you actually have the energy and the desire for your self-care basics. So you do them. You make those amazing energy investments that give you those even more amazing energy returns. In level 2, you can do a lot more and show up a lot more in your life, in your career, but you still probably don't feel super interested in those big, challenging, big picture goals. Level 3, on the other hand, is when you do feel interested in those challenging big picture goals. But the art of level 3 is not neglecting your self-care basics or overexerting yourself and sending yourself back to the previous level. And like I said, there's 3 big mistakes when it comes to burnout recovery that I see folks making and that I've made as I traverse these levels. As a side note, I feel like it's really helpful for a brain when a brain is listening to something auditorily to have a summary. So I try to give summaries. I hope this is helpful for you. But back to those mistakes that I see folks making, made myself. The first one is that you don't let yourself be stopped by life in level 1. You don't fully rest. You resist it. You're still doing too much and pushing too much and trying to be too virtuous. That's the first common mistake I see. The second common mistake is not picking up the things that will actually profoundly serve you, that will actually improve your energy and focus when you do have the capacity to do them. This is going to stop you from even, entering level 2 or really traversing it to what we all want, which is level 3. And the third common mistake is biting off more than you can chew in level 3, which puts you right back down into level 2 or level 1. Though, of course, we can have this mistake in level 2 as well. We can have wishful thinking. We can want to be in level 3, but you're just not. So you need to hold your horses and breathe and keep doing the boring stuff, and you will get there. So those are the 3 most common mistakes. And the last meta note I wanted to make about this model is, all kinds of things can push you down levels. So yes, in the past, what has plunged me back into level 1 is that, for example, my son's seizures came back and he was on this terrible medication cocktail that made him really unhappy and he was crying a lot and he wouldn't even look at us. And yeah, that whole thing was very upsetting. It was very tiring and it threw me right back to level 1. But on the flip side, sometimes, honestly, I'm just kind of annoyed about something that involves my house renovation that's not actually objectively that important. Or maybe I'm just getting my period and whoosh, suddenly I'm exhausted and I'm in level 1. Or I was in level 3, but now I'm in level 2. And look, I have spent time being annoyed about that happening or beating myself up. But what I have found, and this speaks to the very first point I shared today, is that all of that does no good at all. So if there's a lesson to be learned, like, oh man, I acted like I was in level 3, but actually I was in level 2 and I overexerted myself. Sure, learn the lesson. That's great. I'm a fan of learning lessons. But also, sometimes life is just going to do that to you. Life is just going to push you down the levels because it's going to throw a lot out at you. Sometimes just being a person with a human brain and human emotions is tiring. And I try not to make it mean anything too complex that I happen to feel overly tired. I just try to take a breath and I try to do the next right thing for whatever level I am in at the time. So, as we conclude this episode, part 1 on recovering from burnout, it could be interesting to ask yourself, what level are you in currently? And what is needed for you to progress to the next level? Whew. Okay. So this is part 1 of this podcast on recovering from burnout. And of course, if you don't like this idea of levels, as with anything I say, leave it. But it's been very helpful for me personally, and I hope it resonates with you. And next podcast, I will have 5 other ideas for you about recovering from burnout. I hope you enjoy. If you really want to change in a meaningful, lasting way, that's when you need a life coach. Every client I've worked with has had incredibly personalized reasons why they're in the tired or anxious or stuck or uninspired state they're in. Working with me can help you identify those roadblocks, which are usually blind spots that you genuinely cannot see, and implement a profoundly customized, doable plan for overcoming them. I have a very small, high-end, one-on-one coaching practice. If you'd like to be my next client, reach out at katiesiever.com. I'd love to meet you.